All right, good afternoon, everyone. It is right at 3 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and get started. I know we will have people continuing to join us, but this is being recorded. So if you miss any parts of it, you will have the opportunity to go back and re-watch it. Again, thank you for being here for this webinar on back to school resources. This is our second summer series. We did a summer series in June that we covered all things data. And now we are doing this summer series where we really dive into our back to school resources. As you know, this will be a three-part series. So this is part one, and we will continue this conversation next week and the following week in parts 2 and 3, as we give you some really good tools and resources to use during this fun and exciting back to school time. I put some information in the chat. I'll put it in there one more time. If you don't mind completing this short survey, it is just a quick pre-test for us to see where you are, and that can help us determine all the different supports and resources we can provide you to get you to where you are going. So I'll put that in the chat one more time if you haven't completed that yet. I appreciate your attention to that quick pre-test. Also, just a couple of housekeeping items before we get into it. I will send out the slide deck, all the slides that we're going over today following this presentation. So you'll have access to those slides. And also for those of you who are interested in getting a certificate for professional development hours, I will send that at the end of the training following the third part of this. And what you'll do is there will be a post test that you'll complete. And at the end of that, once you have indicated that you have attended all of the sessions and completed the pre and post test, you will get a certificate indicating your participation. I'll email that to you once you've done all of those requirements. I'm also able to track attendance from our Zoom meeting, so I can ensure that you were in attendance that way as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. I think most of you I've had the chance to meet, but I am Sarah Kirk, the school counselor specialist here at the Oklahoma State Department of Education, and I love all things school counseling, and I am passionate about implementing comprehensive school counseling programs. So I'm thrilled that you're here as we continue to work towards implementation of comprehensive school counseling programs in our state. Sorry, that's my dog saying hello real quick as well. All right. So just a quick welcoming activity as we get started. I know that this time of the year is exciting, but also a little bit draining at times. So just a quick little survey to see how charged you are today. So you can take a look at this little image and let us know, how are you feeling today? How charged are you? And you can put your answer in the chat if you'd like. All right, Tracy is in that yellow feeling good zone, which is great to hear. Good. And if you're maybe a little lower, even if you don't want to share, if you're in that orange or red, or maybe even all the way depleted, maybe share just or think in your mind, you don't even have to share, but think in your mind of something you could do to get a little more charged. That way it can kind of give you some motivation. It's the end of the school day, hopefully, so maybe a walk when you get home, or just putting your feet up might help you feel a little more charged. I'm seeing some mez in there, so maybe think through something you could do to get you up, maybe into the yellow or into the green. If you're interested, as you finish this quick activity, I always like to include these activities in my presentations, and they're also something that you could use in your counseling lessons. So these are called the 3 signature practices, and you can see there they include welcoming and inclusion activities, engaging strategies throughout your presentation, and then ending with an optimistic closure. So by adding those 3 elements, your lessons are more engaging, and we can really strengthen the services we provide both to adults and, of course, to our students as well. So I try to put these in my presentations when I can as a model for you to use in your counseling lessons or in any presentations you do with your staff, perhaps as well. All right, well, thank you for sharing. For those of you who put your thoughts in the chat, we will go ahead and carry on now. Thanks again. So like I said, this is a three-part series that we are diving into today on back to school resources. So what I did is I have identified different things within our Oklahoma Comprehensive School Counseling Framework that was published last October and really highlighted some of the components of that framework that are really good to start this time of the year, this back to school time, because I've been told and I realize that the framework is a little overwhelming, right? We know that I see Sherry looking at me and giving me a little smile, and I know she's doing a great job implementing it already, but it is overwhelming. There's a lot of different components and different parts. So what we've done is try to kind of peel back some of those layers and make it a little more digestible. So everything we're going over in this three-part series is straight out of our framework, but we're just giving you it in bite-sized chunks with hopes that it helps with that overwhelming feeling. So these are just a couple of the components that, like I said, are really good things to be doing this time of the year. So during this summer series, we're going to talk about calendars, which is actually our topic for today. So we're going to talk all things annual and weekly calendars today. Then next week, we'll talk about the annual student outcome goals. And then we'll close up with the annual administrative conference. And then I'm going to kind of plug some other things in as we go as well. But those will be our big items that we talk about, again, straight from the framework. And I'll go over a little bit more about where they fit into the framework here in just a minute. So a little bit about where we are. For those of you who had already completed that pre-test that I sent out, then I gathered that data, and this is a little bit old. It says there were just 25 responses, but I think last time I looked, there's over 100. So the data has continued to grow. But I did this so that we can look at where we are, because I think it's really important to identify where we are so we can figure out where it is we want to go. I also think this can help us to normalize how we're feeling and where we are, because many of us are in the same boat. So I told you that today we're focusing on those calendars. So I asked you in that pre-test if you're currently using a weekly calendar. And about 64% of you, and last I checked, this percentage was just around there, had stayed around there even as more of you completed this survey. About 65% of you have a weekly calendar, which is great news. I hope that even if you already have a weekly calendar, hopefully today's presentation will give you some ideas about best practices and ways to continue strengthening the use of a weekly calendar. But it's great to hear that so many of you are already using one. And for those of you who aren't, that's okay. That's where you should be. That's why we're here to talk about it. Again, this framework was just published last October. We haven't even celebrated our 1-year birthday yet. And so it's okay if you're just getting started. So with the next question, I asked you about your use of the annual calendar. And again, somewhere around 70% of you said you are using one, which is great news, but about 32% of you are not. And again, that is why we are here. I then asked you your thoughts on how important using a weekly calendar is. And you can see here that the vast majority thought that having a weekly calendar is important. I have a couple of you I'm going to convince by the end of this that are kind of on the fence about it, but you can see there that no one said that they didn't think it was important. And same here with that annual calendar. So we can see here that we value this, we think it's important, and we're going to go over exactly why it's important if you might be on the fence on why this might be an important component of your comprehensive school counseling program. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Today's presentation, we're going to start really focusing on where we begin in this implementation phase of the comprehensive school counseling framework. So I'm going to make sure you understand where today's topic fits into our framework. Then we'll talk all about creating that annual calendar. Then we'll talk about creating a weekly calendar. And then we will give you a little bit of information on upcoming trainings and events, how you can continue to learn more about the Oklahoma Comprehensive School Counseling Framework. Oops. So let's talk a little bit about where to start. So again, we are as a state in this implementation phase of the Oklahoma Comprehensive School Counseling Framework. We started last year and we're just continuing to gain traction and continuing to progress through this framework. Any of you who have heard me present about this before know that this is not meant to be done overnight. If you are implementing everything right away, I can guarantee it's not done with the type of fidelity and attention to detail that we want it to be implemented with. So it's not meant to be done even in a year or 2 years. It's a process. But the great thing about that process is that each step that you're taking is going to strengthen the supports that you provide to students, whether directly or indirectly. So like today's topic of calendars, it may not seem like it directly impacts the work you do with students, but I promise that it indirectly does, because you're better defining your role, you're better defining how you're spending your time, you're advocating for your role, and you're making sure others know the different components and the different things that you do during the day and during the year. So all of those pieces are really working towards this bigger overarching goal of creating a comprehensive school counseling program. So just keep in mind, this is meant to be done step by step. That's why we are peeling these layers back in the way that we are. And also don't forget that we are continuing to provide ongoing training and coaching and technical assistance. We have a great team at the Oklahoma State Department of Ed. I see my friend Becca on here, and I think there's a couple of other of my colleagues on here, and we're all here to support you in this work. You are not in this alone by any stretch of the imagination. So we're here to provide that, and we know that this is meant to be done step by step, and we know that it's a process. So I appreciate you willing to take this step with me today and know that more is to come. So when I talk about the framework, I think most of you all know, but just a quick summary. This was, as I mentioned, published about a year ago. It is based on the Ask a National model, which is a research-based framework that really outlines the components of a school counseling program that can have positive impacts for students. So it just better defines our role so that we can have that positive impact on student achievement, attendance, and discipline. It's not meant to be a manual on how to do your job. We still need your experience and your expertise. It's not meant to be a step-by-step guide, like on today you do this and tomorrow you do that. That's not what the framework is at all. Instead, it's an overarching framework that just allows you to have a strengthened school counseling program, takes away that idea of random acts of school counseling that aren't based in data, that aren't intentional, and just adds more structure to the supports we're providing. So when we say that we are working towards this implementation, what we mean is that we're working to develop school counseling programs that are data informed. I know many of you did come to my summer series about data informed school counseling. And if you didn't, I'll make sure to give you information about those recordings. You can still catch those, but that's a really important piece of this. Additionally, comprehensive school counseling programs are delivered to all students. So we're not only serving some pockets of students, but instead we're serving all. It includes a developmentally appropriate curriculum. It's created to close achievement and opportunity gaps. And again, that end result is to improve student achievement, attendance, and discipline. So it may seem like, how could a calendar or how could some of these little components end up having improved student achievement, attendance, and discipline? But that's exactly what the framework does. This slide has a ton of words on it, but it really outlines our comprehensive school counseling framework and the 4 components that you'll find within it. For those of you who have had the chance to dive in at all, The framework is broken up into 4 components: define, manage, deliver, and assess. And you'll see here that today we are talking about calendars which fall under the manage component. I always call this manage component the behind the scenes work, because it's what has to be done so that our school counseling programs are more intentional. When we skip over this whole manage component that includes all these other elements too, including writing vision and mission statements and writing outcome goals and creating lesson plans and some of those, then we're not being intentional about how we're providing our services. And what ends up happening is then when we get to the deliver component, which is the good stuff, that's when we actually get to serve students. But our delivery isn't as strong if it's not first created through a strong management component. So again, that's how this component ends up indirectly impacting our students, because we create the really strong foundation in this manage component, and calendars are a part of that. So in this manage component, like I said, I call this kind of the behind the scenes work, the part that no one really ever knows that we're doing, but it's really important so that we can effectively and efficiently manage our school counseling program. It's in this component that we're really organizing and really thinking through what we want our school counseling program to target, what we want to do, and how we're going to structure our program in order to get those results that we want. So again, a component that I think is often ignored, but really important to the overall success of our comprehensive school counseling programs. So again, just to reiterate, you can see here that today we're going to be talking about this component of calendars that falls under program planning. Now, I mentioned that next week we're going to be talking about those annual student outcome goals. You'll see that's also here in program planning. And then we're going to be talking about the annual administrative conference, again, right here in program planning. So this back to school summer series is really meant to help you lay that foundation so that as you go through the rest of this school year, you have some of these components already in place. Now, you might see here that there are others that we're not covering during this summer series, but remember, step by step, we're going one step at a time, and maybe you're already doing some of these others, and that's great too. But know that each step is better serving your students, and it's okay to not do them all at the same time. It's okay to do one by one. But if you see some others on here that you're interested in learning more about, or maybe you're one of those who said, I already have an annual calendar that's really strong and I'm really proud of, then maybe you could look to something else on this list, or maybe you could start writing a vision or a mission statement, some of those other components. So we're all in different phases of this implementation, but we're all in it together. So we'll help you every step of the way. So let's talk about these calendars. Now, I know we all know what calendars are, but I want to make sure and provide a little bit of information about what I mean when I say calendars in a comprehensive school counseling program. So one of the most important reasons we want to have a good annual calendar and a good weekly calendar is because they serve as a really strong advocacy tool. They make sure that other stakeholders understand what our role is and what kind of services we provide to students. Now, when we do this, in order for it to be an advocacy tool, we're going to talk through this a little bit, but we do have to make sure we're sharing these calendars, because if you have a great weekly calendar or you have a great annual calendar, but you're not sharing it with stakeholders, then it's probably not a very good advocacy tool. But what we want to do is develop and publish calendars that are informing our stakeholders, our students and our parents and our teachers and our administrators of what we're doing as school counselors, when we're doing it, and where the activities will be held. Because we also want this to be a reference tool so that a student could look at it and say, oh, look, there's a college night coming up next month, and here's when it is, and here's where it is. So we want these calendars to be really user-friendly, right? We want them to be utilized by our school, by our stakeholders that can really benefit from them. So let's talk first all about the annual calendar. I think both calendars are super important, but if you're going to pick one to start with, I recommend the annual calendar. So if you feel a little overwhelmed by doing both at the end of this, start with the annual calendar and then go from there. So we'll start by talking all about the annual calendar. So the annual calendar is used really just to outline all the different major school counseling activities that are delivered or coordinated by the school counselor, or if you're fortunate enough to have a school counseling team, you only have to have the one annual calendar for your school counseling team as well. So this is meant to show what your whole school counseling program is including. So if that means if you have 3 or 4 school counselors, you're just going to have the one calendar showing what your whole school counseling program is doing throughout the year. And like we said, the annual calendar can really increase the visibility of our school counseling program. I know all the time as school counselors, we get misunderstood and people often don't realize just how busy we are and how much we're doing. And so this annual calendar can really show exactly what all we do to help excuse me, to help serve our students. So it has many different benefits. So some of the activities that you might include on an annual calendar. So for those of you who already have one, make sure that you're including all of these activities and maybe some other things that I didn't mention. So some things that I think are really important to include on that annual calendar are any of your school counseling classroom lessons. So with this, you may not put let's say, for example, third grade bullying prevention lesson with Mrs. Whitehead's class. You may not say that specific on this annual calendar, but instead what I would put is if all of third grade got the bullying prevention lesson or maybe even a bullying prevention unit in October for bullying prevention month, then I would write third grade bullying prevention unit in the October section of my annual calendar. Okay, so think with this annual calendar, it's a little broader than maybe what you would include in a weekly calendar. So keep that in mind as we go. Now, if you do a one-off lesson, like I sometimes had teachers request specific lessons, things like that, then you could add that on there as well. But overall, we want this to be a little more broad so that it's really just a good brief overview of the different services we provide. Also on that annual calendar, you want to include any small groups that you run. So making sure that you include those. We'll talk about this a little more, but of course, make sure you're not including on this annual calendar that's published things that might have identifying information of participants in that small group. We want to be sure to maintain confidentiality. This annual calendar, again, think of it as an advocacy tool. We want this hanging on your bulletin boards or posted on your website or included in your newsletter, those different things. So be aware might be different than like a Google Calendar or an Outlook calendar that you use that might have more detailed information. Also, make sure you're including things like back to school night or open houses that you host or that you're a part of, even if it's not like a back to school night might be a school-wide event, but if you're doing something at that, if you're welcoming new students or you have a booth or whatever it is that you do at that, you're going to include it, even if it's a back to school event that's for your whole school. Any sort of student parent teacher meeting days. So if you have parent teacher conferences where you're meeting with parents and teachers or different things like that, then you want to make sure and include that in there as well. College or career nights or any other type of school-wide event that you might host. Evening activities, again, even if it's a school-wide activity, like we always hosted a literacy night at the school I worked at, but I always did a social and emotional little activity at literacy night. So I still included literacy night on my annual calendar, even though it was a school-wide event. So thinking through those types of activities and making sure those are included as well. Can you think of anything else I didn't include here? Maybe for those of you who already have an annual calendar that you want to make sure and include on there? Anything I missed that you think might be important, or anything you have a question about of if you should include it?
Is this where we could include things like trips to like school bell where the kids get new clothing and distributing food bags and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yes, you could definitely put those types of activities on here. I'm trying to think. So we're going to take a look at the template that's provided in our comprehensive school counseling framework in just a minute. And what you would do for something like that, that isn't just a one-time event, like for those of you who deliver like food bags or things like that, as Jamie mentioned, or maybe you just have a closet, like a clothing closet that you offer to students who need it at any time. There is a section on our template for ongoing services. So I would put those types of things in the ongoing services section, because you don't want to have to list it every month, because you probably do it throughout the school year, but it gets a little repetitive if you include it in August and September and October. Now, if you do only offer something once a year, like maybe you offer a big Thanksgiving food basket giveaway or something like that, then you could include that in November. But great idea, Jamie. And yes, Becca mentioned some other good ones. Awareness Week activities, maybe Red Ribbon Week. If you do something to celebrate Red Ribbon Week in October, you can include that. I mentioned Bullying Prevention Month earlier. If you do things to celebrate and to bring awareness to those types of things. I know many schools do the Great Kindness Challenge in January, or maybe random acts of kindness in February. All of those types of things would be great. Love that. Good ideas. If you think of any others, go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll have time to talk about it more, but I'm going to keep us going so I make sure and get through all of our good information. So I already mentioned making sure that you exclude any sort of names or identifying information. We want to make sure we're protecting confidentiality there. And non-school counseling tasks also aren't meant to go on this annual calendar. So I know I always get a lot of questions about this, because if you're the testing coordinator, or you are, who knows, doing the laundry list of non-school counseling tasks we're often asked to do, we often want credit for those, which I totally get, but the annual calendar is not the place to put those. Now we're going to talk about the weekly calendar and how you can include some of those a little bit. But when we think about the annual calendar, we really want this to be a reflection of our role, of our true role. And so it's really best if we try to stick to those really robust school counseling services that we provide. Now, there are some exceptions, and I certainly understand if, like, when it gets to April, you want to put on there that you do a lot for state testing, because otherwise your calendar looks kind of blank. I was that person. I was like, but my calendar looks so blank if I don't include it. I don't want people to think I'm not working. Then you could certainly put that it's your role to organize and coordinate state testing. I just am always hesitant to say that, because the more that we put that on things like our annual calendar, the more we're saying we have ownership over it. And it's just a really slippery slope. So if you want to include some of those really big things that do take up a lot of time in specific months, I won't argue with you about it, but just be aware of the potential downsides of doing so. And then also with that, the annual calendar, again, we're thinking this is a little more broad. So we don't want to say things like lunch duty or greeting students in the morning, things like that, because while those might be parts of our day, they're not the overarching things that we're doing during our months. So keep that in mind as well. That is information we'll be able to include in the weekly calendar when we get to that. But for this annual calendar, again, thinking more broadly, those big overarching services we provide to students and to our schools. Also, keep in mind that with this annual calendar, and it will make a little more sense when we look at our template in a second, but we want to include enough information to be useful, but we don't want it to be too wordy. So just like any other type of calendar, the more we can kind of list in bullet points or things like that, the better. So that's why I mentioned, like when I said bullying prevention unit classroom lessons, that's probably all I would put. You're not going to go into detail there about what the lessons covered or your goals or the books that you read or things like that. We're going to keep this a little more broad, but enough information so that it is useful. We want to keep in mind our audience is not typically other school counselors. It's other parents and caregivers and students and teachers and principals. So we want them to be able to gain good information from this, right? We want them to have a better understanding of our role by looking at this. So keep that in mind as you add items. We want to make sure we avoid that vague and educational language. So I'm going to pick on Jamie a little bit because she was brave and spoke up a second ago. But she mentioned school bell, and I know exactly what school bell is because I worked in Norman and I took students to school bell, but many other people probably don't. And so make sure that when you include things like that, you say a little enough that helps your audience understand what service that is that's provided. Same for even Red Ribbon Week. Not everyone will know what Red Ribbon Week is. So maybe we always called Red Ribbon Week Prevention Week also. So maybe adding a couple of words in there that might help better define what it is to someone who's not in the school or that maybe doesn't know all of the lingo that we use. With that, of course, we also want to be careful with all those acronyms that we use in education because some of those are, again, not used widespread and not everyone will know what those mean. So just keep that in mind as well. And also keep in mind that as you get started, if this is brand new to you or you're really looking to change up how you've done your annual calendar using the template that I'm going to show you in a minute, it will likely be a live document at first, meaning you're not going to just sit down, get everything into this, and then be done with it. You're going to realize, oh, wait, I forgot to put school bell on there, which Charlene, I'll answer your question in just a second. There you go, Jamie, gotcha. So you may realize all of a sudden, oh wait, I have this big college and career week that I forgot to put on my annual calendar. So you can add it. That's totally okay. We're kind of building it as we go when we first get started. And then the great thing is that then the next year you don't have to start from scratch. Then you'll just kind of adjust and modify and copy and paste and be good to go for the following years. And then you'll just add things as things change and as you add different components to your comprehensive school counseling program. But definitely keep in mind, this is not meant to be like done in a setting and then never looked at again. We want you to continue to add to. Hopefully we're not having to remove too much of things we planned to do and didn't get to it, but of course that happens as well. All right, so when we talk about the organization of this annual calendar. So like I said, it's best if we organize it in a monthly format, but we will have that section that's likely some sort of ongoing services, things that you do throughout the year. Again, making sure we include enough details without it being too much. When we say dates and times, we do want to include those for those big events like college and career nights, parent-teacher conference nights, any sort of evening or big event that you host. But if you're doing like back to the bullying prevention unit, you may not include the dates of that because it's during the school day and you're offering that during your normal counseling lessons. So you don't have to be too specific about that. But if it's something that you want stakeholders to be aware of, then we want to make sure they're given the appropriate information. Let's see. And then I already mentioned this, but just to reiterate, we do want to make sure we're publishing this, right? We want to make sure it's posted on websites or bulletin boards or in offices. We don't want this to sit on a computer. It's not a good advocacy tool if we're not sharing it with others. So let's go ahead and take a look at the template. When we jump into the template, you're going to see that there are these three categories that the activities we do are broken up into. The first is direct student services. So that's just anything we're doing face-to-face with students. Classroom lessons, small groups, college and career weeks, Red Ribbon Week activities, bullying prevention presentation, if we're having speakers into an assembly, anything that students are directly receiving would be direct student services. Now, indirect student services are those things we do on behalf of students. So this would be when we collaborate with other teachers, or we have meetings with parents to help put supports in place, or maybe we make referrals to outside counseling services, those types of things. Those are indirect student services. They're impacting students, but not by us serving them face to face. And then program planning and school support is kind of all the other stuff that we do. So when you think about, when you think about the data collection that we do, or the any sort of lesson planning, you know, when you're planning for your activities, when you're doing those types of things, responding to emails, things like that, that's our program planning and school support. All right, so now let's take a look at that template real quick. Let's see if I can jump over here. All right. So let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. All right, so this is the annual calendar template that's included in our framework, and I'll make sure you have the link to this as well. And when you get these slides, it will be linked in our slide deck. But you can see here, again, those three different sections I talked about: the direct student services, the indirect, and then that program planning and school support. And then this is the section I talked about of those ongoing services. So if it's something you do every month, like delivering food on Fridays, you could put that in the ongoing services because you do it every single month, and that way you don't have to copy and paste it into every month. Now, if it's just an August activity and it's a direct student services, maybe you do a meet the counselor lesson, then you would put that right there in the August section. And of course, you just go down and put in the different activities and the different services you provide month by month in each of the boxes for the month. So this is a template that you can use if you, well, you can use it for anything. You can use it for what you post. You can use it for ways to identify how you're providing direct student services, how you're providing indirect, and that program planning. If you don't like this format because you want it to be more, what's the right word? I don't know, prettier maybe, or more something that's a little bit better for you to post for your stakeholders, you can certainly make your own template. That is totally an option. This is just broken up in a way for you to really look at how you're spending your time. But if you would rather for the annual calendar that you post and that you share with others, if you don't think it matters to break it up into these sections, which maybe it doesn't, you totally don't have to. But I just wanted you to have access to this template in case it is the way you want to do it. Now, if you'll take a look at, let me reshare. All right, let's go back to our comprehensive school counseling framework. Oops, that's not what I wanted to share. All right, let me stop sharing. Let me try again. All right, so in our comprehensive school counseling framework, we have some examples of, here we go, of an annual calendar. So if you'd rather yours look something like this, you can do this as well. We still do have it broken up into those different activities, but you can see here that it does include those ongoing services, and then it jumps to August. And you can see here that this includes some of those examples of things you might be doing. So this is a great tool to use as you get started on creating yours, because it might help you remember, oh yeah, I forgot. I provide FAFSA information in September, and then that will help you to get those things added too. In our framework, you'll see that we have several different examples. This is an example that's for pre-K through 12. So for those of you who are working with all grade levels, you can use this example. We did use a key to indicate which services were provided to elementary, middle, high, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to. And then as we scroll down, sorry if I'm making you seasick, there you go. You'll see that we have an elementary example also. So this is just for elementary school counselors with examples, and a middle school example, and then of course, lastly, a high school example. So you're welcome to use these as well to help you think through the different things you provide. And like I said, just to reiterate, if you don't like the idea of breaking it up into these different components, you can just create a monthly calendar that just includes the things that you do, all of those listed together if you'd prefer, okay? All right, let's get back to our slide deck. As I get us back to our slide deck, if anyone has any questions about that annual calendar, feel free to put it in the chat. All right. All right, I don't see any questions, so we will dive back in. All right, we did all this. Okay, so like I said, you will have access to this slide deck where you'll be able to access the template. I'll also put it in the chat here in just 1 second. And then you'll also have access to the comprehensive school counseling framework starting on page 56 where those examples are. Oh, April asked a great question. She asked, what about if you attend an annual conference? Would you put that on there? Yes, absolutely, April. I'm so glad you asked. And I think you will see that when you look at the examples in the framework. But you can definitely include conferences, trainings, things like that. Typically, that would probably be considered an indirect student service because you are indirectly serving your students by continuing your development. But those are great things to include on an annual calendar because you want to show others that you are committed to your growth and you're continuing to grow your skills as a school counselor. So that's great. You, again, kind of thinking overarching, April asked about an annual conference, and yes, 100% yes. Things like individual webinars like this one, you probably wouldn't include. But what you could do is you could, in that ongoing section, you could say ongoing professional development offered by the Department of Ed and my district or something like that. Or if you attend ASCA trainings, you could say that you ongoing attend ASCA webinars, and that would be a great thing to include in there too. Great question, April. I'm so glad you asked. All right. I'm going to give you guys just a quick 2-minute think time. So again, I told you these 3 signature practices I try to implement into all of my presentations. And this engaging strategy just gives you some time to think. And I'd just like you to reflect on a couple of questions you can see on the screen. How could this benefit you, the idea of having an annual calendar? And then who could you share your annual calendar with once you have one up and running? And feel free to add your thoughts in the chat if you'd like, but I'm going to go quiet for about 2 minutes. I'll come back to you at 3:45. All right. I hope that gave you a little bit of time to think through your next steps with an annual calendar, how this could benefit you and who you could share it with. Sherry and John gave some great ideas in the chat, so make sure you check those out. I love that John said formulating the big picture because that's such a good point about that annual calendar. We're really laying out the big picture of what we do as comprehensive school counselors. And that's a really important piece of this, right? I mentioned at the beginning the idea of in the past we kind of served as random the phrase is random acts of school counseling where you're putting this fire out over here, doing this lesson over here, or all good things, but without really strong intention and without looking at that big picture. And the annual calendar really helps you do that. And then yes, absolutely, advocacy. This is such a strong advocacy tool, both the annual and weekly calendar, because it's really, I say it all the time, but if we don't define how we spend our time, someone else will do it for us. So these calendars, even though it might seem silly, it might just seem like a paper that says what we're going to be doing. You might think, oh, they'll just ignore it. They might, but it's at least one step towards better defining how we're spending our time. Great ideas. All right, let's jump into weekly calendars now. So with weekly calendars, obviously the name describes it. It's pretty understandable here what those are, but it is just a detailed plan of how the school counselor spends their week. Now, I said with the annual calendar, if you have multiple school counselors in your school, you only need one annual calendar. But weekly calendars are personal. So we want weekly calendars to be individualized for each school counselor. So if you're at a high school with 4 counselors, you can have one annual calendar, but you're going to have 4 weekly calendars because you're probably spending your day-to-day differently. So keep that in mind as we go as well. Now, with the weekly calendar, the question I always get is what about all the crises that come up? What about those immediate student needs? What about the fire, down the hall that you've got to go put out that isn't on your weekly calendar? Of course, that is going to happen. I've been a school counselor at an elementary school with 700 students. I certainly understand that happens a lot. But the important thing with the weekly calendar is that we're still outlining how we plan to spend our time. And I promise you that the more we begin using something like a weekly calendar to define how we're spending our time, the more we show what we're going to be missing if we have to go respond to that crisis or that fire or that immediate need, then the less we're going to be asked to do that. If we don't have anything defining how we planned to spend our time, then we're just an easy target. We're an easy person to be asked to respond to those immediate needs. Now, I'm not saying that it's never appropriate for us to respond to immediate needs because it certainly is at times. There are times that it is our job to go and help the immediate situation. But there's also times when it's not appropriate and when we're being misused, right? We know that it happens to all of us. And so it does create a tool to help us advocate for ourselves and for our role. I've told this story many times, so many of you have probably heard it, but when I worked in Tulsa Public Schools, I was brand new and I had already been in a school where I used a weekly calendar. So I just brought that over and adapted it a little bit for my role in Tulsa. And I printed it every week and I put it on my door. And I cannot tell you how many times the principal was on her way in to ask me to do something when she glanced at that and said, "Ooh, I see you have a small group starting in a few minutes." And I said, "I do." And, I'm new. And so I don't want to step on toes, but she just knew that that was important. And it would have been really hard for me to speak up and say, "I've got a small group starting in 3 minutes," when I was brand new and I really liked her and I wanted her to respect me and I wanted to help her, but I didn't have to be put in those tough situations because it was posted and she saw and she knew that I had something to do. Now again, I know not every situation may be like that and there were times I still got pulled and there were still crises that came up and I still had to adapt, but just having that on my door made such a difference. I also always had teachers who, no matter if my door was shut or what was going on, they still want to open the door, they still want to come in. Sherry's looking at me, no, she knows this. But oftentimes that calendar would help them see, oh, she has a small group right now. That's not something I can just walk into. And so it's just a tool. It's not perfect. Nothing we do in comprehensive school counseling is a magical wand. I wish it was, but no individual piece is its own magical wand. But together, each of these pieces help build a more comprehensive program where we're able to better do our true role. So again, this won't be the magic wand that solves it all, but I promise you it's a step in the right direction. So like I was saying, it is important that we do balance the need for flexibility, because there are times that we have to respond even when our weekly calendar says that we're supposed to be doing something. We just have to be a good team player in that way. And we have to serve our students. And sometimes the immediate crisis is more important than the classroom lesson or whatever it is that was planned. But what's important here is that balance, the balance between that flexibility and making sure that we're intentionally delivering what we have scheduled as well. Okay. And we'll get better and better at this with practice, but keep that part in mind as well. And after time, I did get very used to when it was appropriate for me to cancel a lesson and when there was no way I was going to cancel a lesson or a small group over the situation that someone else could handle, and that I could help with once my group or my lesson was over with. So our weekly calendar really helps us to define how we plan to spend our week, knowing that there will be a little bit of change because we need to be flexible to meet the needs of our students. Just like with the annual calendar, it's important that we publish this. So we want to make sure it's actually used. So again, it's okay if you have your, I always had my Google Calendar that I used just for me that wasn't published, that included more detailed information. This is going to be just a little bit different because this is going to be one that doesn't include anything confidential, that is a little more broad. And we'll talk about that when we look at the example in just a minute. So again, some recommended activities, any lessons that you do, of course. Now this is where it might be more specific if you want it to be. So I said that in the annual calendar, I wouldn't write third grade lesson with Mrs. Whitehead's class on bullying prevention, but I might in the weekly calendar if I know I'm going on Tuesday at 9 a.m. to deliver that lesson. That's also a good way for your office staff or your people to know where you are as well in case you're needed, or just for them to know that you're not just wandering the halls and you are in fact in a lesson. So you can include that more detailed information, but of course, still excluding any confidential information. So for your group and individual counseling, you wouldn't include names. You would just say individual student counseling. Meetings with students. So especially, high school counselors often have many ICAP meetings and different meetings to plan schedules and to plan for all sorts of different things. So making sure you're including that again, but not including any identifying information. Any special events that occur when you're consulting or collaborating with other teachers, you want to make sure you're including that in there. If you're doing data analysis, I always include a chunk of time where I would weekly look at my data. So you want to include that on there. And then if you have those fair share responsibilities. So this is where I mentioned that you will include, if you do like a lunch duty once a week or a dismissal duty, you will include that on your weekly calendar. We can consider that fair share responsibilities, meaning that we all in the school do a fair share amount of those different duties. Hopefully you're not doing beyond fair share, but we do want to include that to show that we are contributing in that way. If you're serving on committees, things like that, you want to make sure you're including that as well. Again, to make sure you're showing all your different involvement in the school setting. Anything else that if you already use a weekly calendar, I forgot to include that you think might be beneficial, or any questions about if you would include something here? All right. right, I don't see anything in the chat, so I'm going to keep going. I'm aware of my time. I am going to give you a heads up that I might go over a little bit. If you can't stay, that's okay. We are recording this, but I'd rather include all the information in the recording, and you can check it out later if you're not able to stay with us. All right. So if you think of anything else, let me know, but we will carry on. So what to exclude? So make sure, again, we're excluding any names or identifying information. Now, on the non-school counseling tasks on the weekly calendar. So if you're going to include those non-school counseling tasks, I'd much rather you include them here on your weekly calendar than on that annual calendar. Again, we talked about how that annual calendar is really meant to be, like John said, that formulating of the big picture, showing our whole role, showing what comprehensive school counseling looks like and all the way we serve students. Now, this weekly calendar, if you want to include when you have testing responsibilities and things like that, you certainly can. However, just like I mentioned with the annual calendar, keep in mind that the more that we self-identify with those tasks, the more likely we are to keep them. So just keep that in mind. What I recommend if you're going to include those non-school counseling tasks is that they're somehow identified as non-school counseling tasks, which I'll show you the template I used when I was a school counselor here in just a minute so that you can see that. April asked a good question. She has 2 daughters, and if she knows she's taking them to a doctor appointment, should she place that on her weekly calendar? Likes for her staff to know where I am. I think that's totally fine. I think if you have a personal something come up, you could include that. Again, just being aware and careful that we want to use these as advocacy tools. So we want it to show all the different ways we're supporting our students. But of course, we're also human and we're also moms and all the things. And I think that if you want your staff to know that, that's great. But don't feel like you have to do that if that's something you're not comfortable with. I never included personal things on mine, but if you want to, it's certainly up to you. Totally okay. Good question, April. All right, so just like we mentioned with the annual calendar, we want enough information for it to be useful without it being too wordy. We want it to be a quick glance and able to see where we are, what we're doing, that sort of thing. But again, we don't want it to be too vague. We don't want to use that educational language that no one understands. So making sure it is useful to our audience. Now, the thing with a weekly calendar is we do have to do it weekly, right? So I don't want this to take up too much time because I don't want you spending 2 hours on Monday creating your weekly calendar because that's not what this is meant to be. So what I recommend is building your routines into your calendar so that each week it's practically the same, right? So when I show you my example here in a minute, you'll see that every day at the same time, I did my counseling lessons with the grades that I served. Also, the same part of the day, I did my small groups. Now, this was beneficial not only because it made creating my weekly calendar easier, but it was also beneficial because I was building in routines and my principal really learned that at the end of the day, I was going to be running small groups. That's when I did my small groups. And it also helped my teachers to know when I would likely be scheduling with them to do classroom lessons. So it's really beneficial across the board, I think. Now, it's never going to be perfect. You're going to have things change and that sort of thing. But the more you can build those routines in and make it where you're practically just copying and pasting the same calendar each week, the better it will be and really the easier it will be. Because again, this should not take you more than 10 minutes or so to create each week. I always did mine on a Friday afternoon the week before, so that then it was already posted on my door Monday morning. And I never spent more than 5 or 10 minutes. It might take you more than that at the beginning when you get used to the process, but once you get going, it should be a pretty quick update to the weekly calendar, post it on your door or post it on your website or whatever it is that you choose to do, and then you can carry on. Sorry. All right, I think I've mentioned all that. So let's take a look at the template. All right, stop sharing. All right, so here is the template that I used when I was in the school setting. Again, you don't have to use this specific template if you like something else better, but I used this just because it was quick and easy and it worked for me. If you want to use something fancier, totally go for it. You can break your day up any way that you want to. I always did it in hour increments until I had this one little goofy 30-minute increment down here. I'll tell you why I did that in a minute, but you don't have to do it like that. You can do it every 30 minutes all the way down. You can do it every hour all the way down. You can do it more detailed if you want. But again, keep in mind, this shouldn't be a really extensive project every week for you to complete it. Now, I mentioned that if you're going to include a lot of your non-counseling duties, that it's a good idea. Oops, that's probably too zoomed in. Sorry about that. Then you want to identify them as non-school counseling tasks. So what I did is I just color coded my services that I provided. So if you know, from 11 to 12 I was doing testing coordinating, then I would have filled that block in with that red color. So just to kind of show that that was a non-school counseling task. Again, don't have to do that. That's just the way I did it to kind of help show when I was doing direct services, when I was doing indirect. It was also, I always calculated the percentages. Again, you don't have to, but it's a good way to advocate for your role if you are. We always say we want our direct and indirect services to equal 80% of our time. And when you do this, you might see that it's pretty far off from that percentage, and that's okay, but that's a good information for us to have. So if you want to do that, you can. Again, you don't have to. You can just fill in the weekly calendar portion if that works better for you, but you have that option and that's included in there. If you want to just delete this box at the end, you totally can. It won't hurt my feelings. So now let's look at an example that's in the framework real quick. And again, this is going to look different for your school. This is just an example from when I was in the school setting, but you can see here it does have those color coded different things in there. And then I, for the most part, had the same routines every week. So I greeted students in the morning. My 8 to 9 kind of was mixed up. Oh, there you can see Jamie. I did put in my weekly calendar delivering food for kids bags, so you can include that type of information in there. I had a standing meeting with my admin on Monday morning, so I made sure and included that in there. You can see here from 11 to 12 was when I did my short-term counseling, never listing names of students there. Now, one thing I would have done, this was just an example, so I made it a little more broad, but I would have on these classroom counseling lessons, I would have said what classroom I was in and probably the topic of the lesson. So I would have said, like my example, Mrs. Whitehead's 3rd grade class bullying prevention classroom lesson is what I probably would have put in on a week-to-week basis, just so people could see how often I was getting into the classroom, what different topics I was teaching on, that sort of thing. But you don't have to. If you want to just leave it broad, totally fine too. I did the same thing with small groups. I would say emotion management small group, if that was the topic of the group or whatever the specific topic was. But you don't have to if you don't want to. So that's an example. You can see here, then I had the percentages, but again, you don't have to do that part, but it can be a good advocacy tool if that's something you want to use. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and take us back to our presentation. And I promise we're almost done. Thanks for sticking with me, even though I had a feeling I was going to go over my time just a little bit today. All right, all right. Okay, and so you can find that template here, and you can also find that example here. And again, you'll get these slides soon. All right, so I'll skip our engaging strategy since we are short on time, but I do want you to take a minute at some point and download that template. Again, you don't have to use the template, but it will at least give you a place to start. Take a look at that example, and maybe make a note to start working on this. This is something that is easy to do, easy to get started, but a great way to start advocating for your time. So I often get asked, is this just another thing? And it really isn't. Like we said, if we don't define how we're spending our time, someone else will. We only have so many hours in the day. And so the more we can advocate for our true role and serving students, the better we're going to be able to do it. So make sure you keep that in mind as well. I know it can seem like another task and something else we have to do, especially this weekly calendar that does need to be updated frequently. And if that's too much for you, create a broader one that isn't updated weekly. It will still better define your role. I'd rather you do that than nothing at all. So even if you want to just create kind of a generic weekly calendar that's pretty close to how you spend your time, that's a fine place to start. I think the more specific we can be, the better we're advocating for our role. But don't not do it because it seems like too much. We really want to make sure we're defining how we're spending our time so that someone else doesn't do it. And if you are wanting to get your annual calendar or weekly calendar up and running, but you're not sure if you're doing it right, send it to me. I'm happy to take a look at it. I get emails like this all the time of someone saying, in fact, I got one yesterday from someone who created an annual calendar and wanted me to take a look at it and see. And we ended up just jumping on a Zoom call and we talked through some things they could add, and it was great. She did a really good job on it. But I'm happy to give you that feedback if that interests you. You can just shoot me an email anytime. And one final thing, I'm calling this the extra credit of the day because you certainly don't have to do it. But when we talk calendars, it's impossible to not mention the use of time calculator because they really go hand in hand. And if you're not familiar with the use of time calculator, it is linked right here. It's an Excel spreadsheet that does just that. It calculates how you're using your time. You can put in information about how you're spending your day. It's just meant to be done in 1 week. So it's pretty detailed, much more detailed than that weekly calendar we looked at. But you only have to do it for 1 week. If you do it for 1 week in September or October, I promise you it will give you incredible information about how you're spending your time. And it's another great advocacy tool because it's a great thing to share with your principal to say, hey, look at how I'm spending my time. What can we do to shift this towards some more direct student services or that sort of thing? Also, if you're tech savvy, then the Aska app allows you to track your use of time there as well. I've never used that before. That came out after I was out of the school setting, but I've heard that it makes it really easy. So you can, if you're an Aska member, you can download that app for free and you can use that as well. But if you don't want to, this Excel document is super easy to use and I'm happy to help you if you're ever interested. And in case you're not sold yet, I got this email from a school counselor this summer and I asked her for permission to share it with you all and she said I could. She had started tracking her time and she was tracking it not just in the weekly format, but actually ongoing. She was tracking her direct student services. And when she met with her boss, he was trying to give her additional work duties in February. And she said that's by far her busiest month, according to the data she'd been collecting. And she pulled up the data and it changed his tune immediately. It was crazy. He found someone else for the extra work and she sent me a link to her spreadsheet. So it was pretty cool. So this work does matter. These advocacy tools do make a difference. Think about if she hadn't have been doing that, she would have had to take on that extra role, I'm sure, because she wouldn't have had any real good way to say or to advocate to not. It's sometimes us saying, oh, but I'm really busy isn't enough because everyone's busy in the school setting, right? And so the more we can collect this data, have these calendars, use these tools to show how we're spending our time and to really identify what it is that we're doing to support students, the better off we are, and we can use that to advocate for our role even more. So as we close, I just want to make sure you're aware of some upcoming training and events to continue to learn more about comprehensive school counseling. Like we mentioned, this was just part 1 of this training. So we have part 2 and part 3 next week and the week following. We also are continuing our coffee with counselors. We had our first in August and it was a great success. So I hope that you'll join us next week, next Tuesday, September 6th from 9 to 10. It's come and go if you are not able to come for the whole time. And you can register for that link on that link, and that will register you for all of the different coffee with counselors. And if you'd like to learn more, we do have an OSDE Connect course. We'll be sharing more about that in the coming weeks, but that is a way you can asynchronously get more information on our framework. I mentioned the data-driven summer series. That information is here. You can check out all of those resources and watch those recordings if you missed it. We heard from many that that was a really great way to get some different data-driven supports into their school counseling program, which can be a scary thing for everyone. So check that out if you're interested in learning more. There's also links to pre-recorded webinars here if you just haven't had enough. And then there's some books and online learning if you are interested in additional support. I will make sure you get all of those resources when I send out the slide deck, and you can check out more on your own time. And as we close out our time together, again, thank you for those who were able to stick around. And I would just leave you with this idea of what is your yet? So what could be your next thing, your something that you maybe aren't doing now, but could be your yet. Maybe it's an annual calendar, maybe it's a weekly calendar, maybe it's that use of time tool, maybe it's something completely else. But as we end together, think on that. And I hope that you will remember that it's okay if we're not doing it yet. That's the power of yet. So thank you for joining me today, and I will see you again next week for part 2 as we dive into annual student outcome goals. So with that, let me know if I can do anything else to support you, and I will see you next time. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Okay, Sarah, what was the at the end there? It was that breathe thing that went out and back in. Where did you get that?
That one?
Yes.
If you Google breathing and then GIF, 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 whatever that word is, you'll find all of them.
Okay, perfect. That was what I was looking for.
Yep,
So,
yep. Perfect.
yay!
There's lots of them out there.
Okay, thank you.
All right. You're welcome,
Bye-bye.
Sherry. Thank you. Bye.